Hello and welcome to the Empower Couples podcast, where here you get modern, non-boring relationship advice for you and your partner to communicate like pros, fight smarter, and stay on the same team no matter the challenge that you face. I am one of your hosts, Aaron Freeman.
And I'm Jocelyn Freeman, but you all just know us as the Freemans.
And this episode is about repairing resentments, big or small. They do need to be dealt with.
I know resentment is not a sexy word. You're not like, yeah, let's talk about resentment.
Let me get in there and repair my resentment.
We just finished a sex and intimacy series. That's a fun topic to explore. However, even though resentment isn't the most fun topic to look at and feel and explore within yourself and your relationship, it must be done. And in this episode, we're going to break down, what does resentment really feel like? Because sometimes it can almost be dormant beneath the surface. What it does within your partnership, like what is the impact of letting it be there? Sources of it, which came from so many of your submissions, and what are some things you can do to deal with it, repair it, not let it be impacting this partnership that could be even more amazing?
We'll start with a quote that you probably have heard at one time, but it's not that often. So resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die.
Okay, tell me again. So you're saying resentment is like poison. Say it again.
It's like drinking poison.
Mm-hmm.
Drinking poison, and yet you expect the other person to die.
Isn't that
it's got
so
a very
true?
Roman or like early ages connotation to it, right? It's like we don't give people poison to try to kill them anymore. But yeah, it is this holding on to resentment and not dealing with it and just suppressing it and keeping it within, you feel like is going to kind of get them. They sort of deserve this type of attitude or actions from you for what they did to you or for what they haven't done that you asked them to, whatever it might be, right? We're going to get more to the specifics, but it's you're holding this in almost as a way to sort of punish them. It's not doing even as much to them as it's doing to you.
Yes.
So that's where you get, it's like you're drinking poison because you're holding on to it, but you're expecting it to be an impact or negatively affect the other person.
Yes.
When it's literally doing the most damage to you.
Yeah, and what is really tricky about resentment is that it can be like this dormant thing, or like, how you just get a sore neck and you can kind of start to live with it, especially if it lasts for a while. You just start to become used to just kind of feeling tight and uncomfortable a little bit.
That's
you can
interesting.
ignore it. You can have a perfectly fine day, but all of a sudden you can lay down and just be like, gosh, it can really start to impact you. It can flare up. It can get bigger. It can be to the point where you can't turn your neck anymore. And that's what it can be like sometimes in a partnership, is it's just beneath the surface. And then when it gains momentum and it gains more power, it all of a sudden can be like, oh my gosh, we are not in a good place right now.
The word that came to me was function. So when you have a sore neck, you can still function. So it's not painful enough for you to deal with it or make the change that you need to.
Yeah.
Where the early on resentment, if you will, can you still function? Yeah, you can manage the life tasks together. You can manage your marriage together. But is it worth it?
Yeah. So what it can feel like, and it is a complex feeling, and it can, again, kind of exist in different ways within us, but just some words, it's an underlying displeasure or frustration, just a taste of bitterness. So it can be just like a little sprinkling on top, or it can be like really sour. And this is where couples are maybe more at a place of, we are not in a good season, things are not going well. But again, it could be just like a hint of bitterness as well. Like it is a ranging scale, or just feeling wronged, just feeling kind of like this disconnect from someone because you're just wronged by them, almost like they're a little bit of an enemy. You may not see, you may be like going on dates still, or you might, have dinner with them still, but there's just a little bit of, And that's what's interesting too. We're going to, of course, focus on your partnership, but you can have resentment towards your job, towards your boss, towards a coworker, towards your life.
A friend, a family member, a parent.
Oh, I mean, it shows up within in-laws.
A child, actually. I mean, We talk with couples that resent how their life now has to be because of certain challenges that their own child is going through, and they feel like they didn't choose this. So a part of resentment too is something is happening to you and you feel like, in a sense, a victim to it. Like you didn't choose this.
Yeah. So resentment, though, blocks you. And this is really important, because why we want to invite you to explore this, even though it's not the most fun thing, is it is blocking you from true intimacy. Intimacy, that profound connection, that fulfillment. How can you be completely fulfilled in your life and your partnership if there's some underlying resentment? It's blocking you from feeling like you can move forward. And this is a big thing, right? Because whether it's in our workshops or if we're starting coaching with couples, we can tell within the first couple sessions of working with couples, we're diving into communication principles, and we can just immediately go, all right, we are teaching you these skills, but there is some stuff that is unsaid. And there is some resentment you have not tackled and dealt with. So when it's there, you can gain all the tools in the world, but you have to face the resentment to have it truly last and actually let you move into the future without like, oh, we have a good 3 days and then we backtrack. Good 3 days, backtrack. That's a signal that there's some resentment that needs to be dealt with.
Yeah, and typically it sparks surprise conflicts. And often it's the surprise because it seems to come out of nowhere, for one, and it can be about something that you're not even talking about. That's where sometimes the conflicts around dishes or clothes on the ground or how they spoke to you, then you reference the past. All of these things really can seem very complex and random, and why are we talking about this, and why are you bringing up the past again? It doesn't make sense. This wasn't even what we were talking about. Well, when this resentment is there and not being dealt with, that is what's going to rise to the surface. It's not really about the subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go into some sources of it, and then we aren't going to leave you hanging. We're going to go into some ways you can tackle this alone and together. So this is from both our sessions as well as we had you submit online. And there were a lot of different responses, so I'm going to try to summarize them into kind of the high level ways, sources of resentment. First is feeling a lack of clear or desired boundaries with in-laws or friends. And the key word being boundaries. So we can become resentful when a boundary is crossed and we've tried to instill a boundary or express it, and yet it continues to be crossed. And, several of the submissions just happen to be about like in-laws or the friends, they talk about me to their parents, or they, talk about me to their friends. They share information I'm not comfortable with. And so that
or
boundary,
even in a sense, because I was thinking back to some of the conversations we've had with couples, this is a great point you bring up, that when the family member, let's say, or a friend says something even indirectly about you, and these boundaries, these agreements are not set up, then the feeling of resentment comes up like this. You didn't have my back. Or I'm not as important to you because you didn't support me or have my back. You weren't on my side when the friend or the family member said that thing. Then that starts to create that gap between the two of you. Oh, you're siding with them. And the more that happens, that's definitely going to build resentment.
Huge. So overall, a lack of clear or desired or honored boundaries or agreements, as you said, and that could look a lot of different ways. Also, a second one being feeling an unfairness in responsibilities. Now, a lot of times this is expressed, specifically in the context of the home. I do more around the house. I have to tell you what to do. And not only do I tell you, but then you don't do it, or I have to repeatedly tell you. And so there can be this buildup of resentment because it feels as though the load is on one person. But then what's interesting, because this even comes up when we talk to couples, is the other person can feel like that's unwarranted because they focus on what they do and they see, but what about all these other things I'm doing? So then it can become very complex and this battle for fairness but almost like a tallying.
Yeah.
But I do know that and we'll probably do a whole episode on like mental load and just kind of this imbalance of roles within the home. I think that's an important topic to do soon, but I think it's important to recognize if there is resentment, because you're not operating as a team managing the house, and it shouldn't be all on one person. And it shouldn't take one partner managing the other person. I just got to say it. Like, your partner should not have to parent you. Your partner should not have to tell you repeatedly what to do. And you should really be a team when it comes to the house. And also, we have to look at if we're holding resentment because we do have a certain role and maybe it's different than what we envisioned and dreamt of, but maybe it's what's needed in the season. So we have to also check our own resentment too and go, is this fair for me to hold on to? Or is this what our family needs? And I need to step into this role and just really kind of embrace the things that I do around the house. Because just letting that resentment linger for what you have to do, that is the poison that you're drinking yourself for sure.
Part of that one is that you feel forced to do something or settle in an area when you didn't agree to it.
Mm-hmm.
And probably one of the biggest areas, if we were to generalize, it could be for women that do more around the house. And forever, the traditional roles have been that, men work, are quote unquote the breadwinners. I just feel like we're getting, that's such an old traditional model. I think we're literally so far past that.
It's 2022. Like, we need to.
It doesn't even matter the year, because that's funny. Because you can go back and find things like, oh, it's the year 2000, and at one point someone probably said, oh, it's 1960.
Things should be different.
I don't care about the year. I care about the level of balance, really, the level of equality, if you will, from genders to races to cultures. Like, none of that matters. You should be able to get to choose and communicate and create agreements around what your gifts are and what you're agreeing to manage the tasks of life and of marriage. So literally gone should be the days of that you just fall into a role, especially around the house, that you didn't feel like you agreed to. And honestly, if you're listening to this and you feel like this is a place that you fall, you got to take ownership. You're going to get the answer to all this, right? But you have to take ownership if you were the one that just took up the mantle of cleaning the house. You knew that you didn't want that role, or at some point, maybe you got a couple of years in and you're like, oh, you know what? I never really clearly communicated my desires around this to not be this role. And I'm kind of giving the answer away. You don't get to just hold on and be resentful about that, especially if you haven't communicated that's not what you want.
Yeah, that is very true. And I think, we're giving the home example, but the higher, perspective about this source of resentment is, feeling as though you are forced to do something that you didn't agree to, which happens by default. So, for example, there might be resentment if you just never you never talked through it, and you feel as though you're the one that has to manage finances. And you resent it. Or drawing a parallel outside of the relationship within the workplace. If you feel as though you're doing a role that you actually didn't sign up for, or you never said like, yeah, I can do that, you can resent your boss or your coworker because you're like, I didn't want to do this. But you have to look, and that's where we'll get to the what to do about this. We have to just see that, man, it does feel like we're being wronged if we're doing things that we didn't agree to, but that doesn't mean you get to stick around with the resentment. So we'll keep going. I think a couple other sources of resentment, and then we'll move on, is feeling perpetually misunderstood or invalidated. And I think to boil it down even deeper is feeling like emotions are not okay. Like, you can't be human. You can't be yourself. You're told you shouldn't feel that way, or you express emotion and it's always misunderstood. I mean, that's probably one of the biggest sources of resentment, because we're human beings and emotion is part of life. And with this romantic, intimate partner that you have, one of the key things we need is to feel understood. And if we've been feeling misunderstood for a long period of time, you better bet that's going to build into resentment.
Well, I just have to link to what I just posted as a story. And before you get shocked and fall on the floor, yes, I did post a story to our Instagram. It wasn't Jocelyn, but I was reading a book today, and it was about attachment. and we'll probably talk more about that. But my main and biggest takeaway was about if you as an adult, or probably specifically you as a parent, are not even connected to your own emotions, and I'm going to summarize here, who are you to try to raise a child?
Whoa. Whew.
If
That's
you are
spicy.
not in touch with your own emotion, like, you have no business
Now, before you shut us
trying to
out,
raise another human being, because you're barely raising yourself. If you are not connected to your emotions, and that is going to be shown in how readily accepted emotions are in your own marriage.
that's true.
If they're not accepted and your partner doesn't feel that way, then probably when your child has an emotion, and if they're younger, like Sky is, don't have language or are just building their vocabulary, they're going to express their emotion in way different ways, just through sound or through the words that they know. And I'm even thinking about this for myself. I told you today, when Sky goes to sleep and she gets to a level of volume that I'm like, this doesn't even match up. Like, you don't need to be getting this loud. And it's internal. I've actually done really well with my own emotion around that. But as I told you, I would pat her and shush her, like, shh, shh. And I realized, what am I even teaching with that? That it's not okay to express yourself. I know that might seem like I'm really stretching with that, but that's the pattern I'm instilling. That if your expression at the level of child that you are right now does not meet what has me feel comfortable, then I'm going to shush you, or I'm going to try to get you to understand what is quote unquote socially accepted or accepted in our family. And that's just diminishing, even from 5 months, her expressing herself or being with emotion.
Yeah, it's like, I want you to...
That last thing.
Yeah.
So there's even resentment that's going to build up there. Like, if it's not okay from an adult to a child to express the emotion, they're going to start resenting you. Because what was it going to come out later? Oh, you didn't accept me for who I am.
Yeah.
Right? Because who you are is the expression of your emotion.
And that's why I think this is one of the biggest sources of resentment, because in a partnership, you want to feel like you can be yourself. And part of being you is having emotions sometimes.
What else is there?
I know.
I mean, if you think about who you are, what is it except the expression of your thoughts and your emotions? There's really nothing else.
Yeah.
And if you do not accept and allow those emotions, or you invalidate them, what else are you creating except resentment in your partner?
Woo. Okay. I'm like feeling fired up here. Now, one more to go into, and then we're going to get into what to do about this, is a certain need going unmet for a longer period of time. Now, we have talked about needs in many different episodes, and sometimes those are expressed needs and sometimes unexpressed. And so if we are talking about expressed needs, you've vocalized it to your partner's even said things like, okay, yeah, and then it's not happening, then that can be really frustrating. And that's not just frustrating, that can build resentment, because it's like, you hear me say these things, you say you're going to do something about it, and yet you don't. Like, that's about follow through and reliability. And if you are with this partner, again, a partner, you want to feel like they're on your team and they are, lifting the load with you. And if they're not following through, then of course that's going to build into resentment. Now, we know you could be listening to this episode and thinking all about your partner and why you're justified in being resentful towards them. But now we're going to get into what to do about it, because we want to challenge you to not let yourself live with this anymore. Whether you feel resentment towards your partner, or maybe in hearing this, you might go, ooh, I think my partner might have some resentment towards me, and I can see my responsibility in that. Because we want to cover this in terms of things you can do individually that don't require talking to your partner, or like having them be a part of healing the resentment, and things to do to heal together. But I think if we were to boil it down, the main thing that lets resentment linger, whether that's lingering for a week, a year, a decade, like however long it's there, because it can start as a small seed and grow and grow and grow and become this, it can eventually become a total rift that feels unrepairable for some couples. But what keeps it going is that it doesn't get addressed, acknowledged, and resolved. Just like we talk about arguments. If you leave it unresolved, it's going to build this residue up. And the thing is, it's not...
Well, let me just add one quick thing. How could it be resolved if it's not expressed?
Right.
I mean, so that was really the kind of a linear step that you just mentioned. There's no way to resolve something if you are not clear about expressing it. So the answer really comes down to assertiveness. But you want to go dive into, there's many different kind of layers to this.
Well, before that, I just have to say one more line. You don't want to make the fact that resentment exists in your partnership wrong, as in like it shouldn't, you shouldn't feel resentment towards me. How could you? How dare you? Or if you guys were to discuss this, it's not, making each other wrong or feeling as though you're bad people because this is here. This has just got to be a cleanse. Like if you do a detox for your body, you're not like, how dare you, body, having a buildup of toxins? How dare you, body? No, you're like, okay, toxins have built up and we need to purge the toxins.
I hadn't thought about this because who was responsible for putting the toxins in the body?
Oh, you. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So at some point you have to start with taking responsibility for you drinking the poison.
Yeah.
Because now it's the flip side. It's not you just drinking the poison and hoping that they die. It's like you have to take ownership that you chose to drink poison.
Yeah. So repairing the resentment. Are you guys down for this now? Yes.
So if I wasn't clear, the resentment that you have has to start with, I created the resentment within myself.
That is the first step. You're
Yeah,
so
the
right.
first step. And then there's going to be obviously some steps and some conversations for you to make requests and set agreements, of course. But
Right.
it really does start with even, to your point, before asserting, you have to get clear about what is it that I'm harboring or holding on to, and then what have I not actually expressed or asserted that is causing me, because I'm creating this. I created the resentment.
Yeah. And so in terms of repairing it to exactly what you're saying, the first step is, it's taking responsibility that you created it within yourself. I think step 2, before we give you some specific actions, is, am I willing to let this go? Like, am I willing? And that's what we'll ask clients sometimes once we identify there is resentment. Before we even tell them how, before we walk through those conversations, we ask, are you willing to let this go? Like, it's going to maybe take some time, some conversations. Are you willing? Because the willingness is key. If you're like, nope, I am righteous, I have a right to be resentful, and you want to push your partner away, that's unfortunate. But you have to be like, okay, I'm willing. I'm willing to do the work. I want to let go of this resentment wherever it's from.
I have to add one quick thing because we're going to be talking a lot more about personal development. And I think this is a great introduction to that. We do listen to a decent amount of Joe Dispenza, and he was talking about the emotional home. So I just want to link to this really quick. You have a familiar emotional experience in what we're calling resentment. If that is your dominant home, but you go to a similar, a frequent, a consistent emotional place in your relationship, not because it actually serves you, but only because it's familiar. And this was really powerful for me to get. If you're listening, you would think that, my mind and my humanness would be built to focus on the things that serve me or that are positive. That's just not how it works. It is about what is familiar to you. And sometimes pain and fear is the most familiar to someone, so that's where you go. If resentment is the most familiar feeling to you right now in the marriage, you're going to keep going to that.
Yeah.
And you have to start to take the right steps to take ownership of what events and what thoughts have been leading to me feeling this resentment. And I need to be willing, as you're saying, to let go of this resentment and create ultimately a new emotional home.
Yeah. So with that, if you're listening, you're like, okay, I've got the willingness, Freemans, then I think a really key place to explore first before going to your partner and kind of being like, I am resentful for you, this, is you have to ask yourself, well, these things I'm feeling resentment about, which are ultimately unmet needs, have I been expressive about them? Have I been assertive and clear about these needs to my partner? Or am I resenting them for things that I mentioned years ago and they're not doing? Or I actually haven't been all that clear. So I think that's a really key place to practice first is clear assertiveness, which is something we help a lot with in our sessions. And we'll talk about that in a minute, is how to clearly and in a healthy way express and assert yourself.
Well, let me do a little hot seat with you.
Oh, okay.
So what would this kind of sound like? I'm going to go down through the sources and tell me about how you would go about after you've taken responsibility. What would you do as far as assertiveness?
Yeah.
So first one was about, so what if you do not have clear boundaries with in-laws and friends? What would that sound like?
Yeah, so I would, go to you and just say, hey, I realize that I haven't been all that expressive or assertive in sharing with you my desire for having an agreement around, what you talk about with your parents related to our marriage. And I would love to share with you that what would mean the world to me is before you share something going on in our relationship, if it's a challenge, if you'd ask me if it's okay before you bring that up.
Well, that's great. How about the second one? And we'll just kind of rapid fire here. What about if you have some feeling of resentment around an unfairness or imbalance of responsibilities?
Yeah, I would come to you and I would say, hey, I have been feeling a bit like overwhelmed and feeling like a lot is on my plate around the house. And I'm realizing that I've kind of just vaguely mentioned to you that I need more help. But if I could tell you specifically, there's like 3 things that if you did these every weekend, it would help me so much. Can I share those 3 things with you? And then, you would, I'm sure, say yes.
Yes, I can do number 1 and 2, but number 3, I'm not about that. But maybe we need to hire someone.
Yeah, well, and I didn't even tell you so first I'm checking that I can even tell you the 3 things, right? Yeah. And then I might be like, hey, it'd mean a lot if you did this and this and this. So are those good examples?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay, good. Well, then these are things you're working on yourself within this resentment, coming together now. Because if you want to discuss this episode with your partner, we don't want you to just go to them and be like, I have all this resentment and I want to, tell you about it, because that might not be received well unless you've created a lot of safe space. So before we give you some tips on that, we know when we were designing this episode that it was going to potentially bring some stuff up. And we have been doing a ton of assessment review calls with couples. And we typically only offer the opportunity to take this relationship assessment that's been around for 40 years. 4 million couples have taken it. We've taken probably close to 500 couples through this now. And we typically only offer it at our workshops in person and on web classes sometimes. But we want to open up 5 spots to do this in June. You'll be able to pick the slot, the time to do the call with us to go over your assessment. And the assessment is seriously so enlightening. It will help clarify kind of how you both are contributing to resentment, where you're just creating these patterns. I mean, there is so much that can be revealed from this assessment. And on the call, we can help you both see things you can do better. Like, we are not going to be biased. We're going to talk to you both about how you can be better. So if you want to get one of these 5 spots, and anytime we've ever offered this, they go very, very fast. So don't wait. Then email us or text us. Okay, to get this, text 602-321-5652 and say assessment. Okay, and that will also be in the show notes, and then the email would be connect@newpowercouples.com. and just say assessment. We're going to give you the best discount on this to do it. It's only $147 to do the call with us and the assessment, worth probably $2,000, honestly. That's how much it makes a difference. So that's to help you navigate these conversations together. But some suggestions is, if you're going to discuss resentment together, it cannot be just blindsiding each other while you're doing the dishes or at bed, bedtime when your partner's exhausted and you want to spring this conversation about resentment on them. It has to be an intentionally created safe space to say, hey, we listened to this episode. We both want to unpack this resentment together. And it is one person sharing. The other person doesn't get to defend, say, well, you shouldn't feel that way. It is, if you're going to talk about this, it is going to be, I hear you. I can see that. I could imagine feeling the same way, because you cannot make your partner's resentment wrong. Like, it is their perspective. Now it's their choice to let it go or to want to move past it. But if you're going to create this safe space with each other, it has to be truly just listening to why there's been resentment. Hey, I have been, like if I came to you and I was like, we're discussing this and you're on board with discussing resentment, and I shared with you, hey, I've been feeling some resentment about just like how much I'm doing around the house. Like, I feel tired. I don't really get to take care of myself. I can't remember the last time I took a bath, and I know you're doing a lot too, but I'm realizing that I feel as though I sometimes have to tell you what to do, which only adds to my mental load. And, so that I'll shorten it, like, period there. You, Aaron, could not be like, but what about me doing X, Y, and Z? That's only going to perpetuate it, right? The resentment would just keep going if you jumped in and invalidated it.
Yeah. I was just thinking about being in that role. It started to be a little much for me to take on. So if I was just to give another just invitation of the way to say something, start with what we've already covered. Hey, I realize my resentment is starting to build up, but take ownership because I have not yet expressed this thing. Mm-hmm. I haven't really come to you. I haven't expressed that. I haven't been able to take that bath, or I feel overloaded with the job and the activities that I'm doing. Or going back to what we talked about, if you feel like you were forced into something, I wouldn't say, my resentment's building up because you forced me to do this.
Right. No.
I would say, I'm feeling this resentment and I'm wanting to express this, and I realize I never verbalized, I never asserted or expressed that this one particular thing, I don't feel like I got to decide if I want to do that or not.
Yes, I think that is great. And you're not kind of offloading this resentment and being like, deal with it. The intention of the conversation is that you're clearing it out. Kind of like, you could even have a fire and be like, let's put the pieces of paper of resentment in the fire. Like, your goal together, if you're going to discuss this in a safe space, is let's purge this. Let's get rid of this so that we can move forward. And then together, if you both share, you both hear each other, you don't make each other's resentments wrong, the next step would be then ideally identifying new agreements, maybe new actions. Once you're emotionally understood, action comes after emotional understanding. But what are the ways that we can counteract this resentment? Because if it's been about, an unfairness of roles, or it's doing things we don't feel we've agreed to, or maybe we've been, rejecting each other's emotions. What are some new things we can implement? Our commitments moving forward, right? What's our plan of action to repair this? So, I think we've shared a lot here, Aaron. This is a really in-depth topic to go into. You may want to listen to this more than once, because resentment isn't just like listen to resentment, let it go. It takes some exploration and some time. And so we hope this episode was clarifying. It had you really identify some key things and really approach this with love, with grace. This is about healing and repairing, not causing more damage or blaming the other person. Again, we can help navigate that conversation by doing this assessment and call with you, and make sure that it feels constructive. So make sure you either text us or email us to take one of those 5 spots. We'd love to do that with you in June and make it a great summer together. So we love you all, and we would love to know how this episode made a difference for you, and we will talk to you on the next episode.